So, here we are in the advanced section where I'm going to get a little bit archaic with everybody. All right, so my first question, I'm going to ask it, and I sent you the questions beforehand and everything, but I have to, explain it a little bit for everyone else. My first question is going to be, what would you say the center of gravity of the list is? Now, this is one of those terms that if anyone here is a fan of, Napoleonic warfare memoirs called On War, then you'll be familiar with this term. But what center of gravity is, it's a military term that is basically, it talks about what is the actual standout strength of a military formation? What is the advantage in a battlefield setting that it's going to try and leverage in order to defeat the enemy and achieve all of its objectives? Like most formations throughout history, in fiction, in reality, they all have something that they're good at and things that they're not so good at. And one of the ways that they try and, maintain proper center of gravity is to make sure that when they're doing things that they're good at and avoiding things that they're bad at. So the question that I sent John here is, what would you say the center of the center of gravity of the list is? And that as explanation, I have, what is the main strength of the list? What does it do better than everything else in the meta? And what is the key strategy / interaction / concept that it leverages to win games? And I suppose the biggest thing that I want to stress here is at the end of most of your games, what does the table look like? What did the course of the game look like? Because if you played lists enough times, you generally have enough data to go, well, by turn 5, generally X, Y, and Z has happened when my plan goes off successfully. So with that just absolute chonker of a question, go ahead. What would you say is your center of gravity?
So the center of gravity for Bloody Rose good stuff is what most people call it. I still like Falls Moving Castle. Mm-hmm. Is that you charge really well. So what I'm best at is charging people and punching them in the face and absolutely leaving no survivors. And so you build a couple of tools into the list to make sure that you build for your strength, because you don't want to find out that your strength isn't strong enough. Sure. And then you build a couple of tools in the list to make sure that your strength is not easily countered. So, how to make your strength better is have all of the buff characters that you could possibly need. I have the Dogmata to give +1 attack if necessary, to give +1 advance and charge necessary because I don't want to fail charges. I have Miracle Vice to make sure that I don't fail charges. I have the Repentia Spear to make sure that the Repentia advance and charge and hit harder so that I can go charge things farther. I have More of Involve to make things hit harder because I don't want to not hit hard enough. Mm-hmm. And then I have the Canoness who can make people fight last, that they don't interrupt and get around my strength. And she also turns off invulns to make sure that they don't high roll my strength. Mm-hmm. And then I'm Bloody Rose that I get an extra attack and extra point of AP so that I hit harder and people don't get around my strength. Mm-hmm. And then there's somehow still even more, I think. There's a suite of 4 Bloody Rose stratagems that are make myself hit a little bit harder. Mm-hmm. There's +1 to hit against Psychers. There's 6s to hit auto wound. There's full rerolls to hit in combat. There's that's a generic one. Sure. Then there's 6s to wound to do extra damage, which again, once you start getting full rerolls to hit, full rerolls to wound, it really adds up. The army, as it gets a sacred right as a choice, you take the passion every time, and that's exploding 6s in combat. And you just build into your strength until there's nothing that can stand in front of your strength unchallenged. Mm-hmm. No one walks up to the Sisters army and says, I know you hit hard. I don't think you hit hard enough. Absolutely no one has that as a game plan, and no one has that as a game plan twice. Sure.
Certainly.
I have not found a single army that can step up into charge range and say your turn and have it be okay. And then I just try to have enough shooting elements and tricks and pieces around it so that people don't get around my strength and still win the game.
Okay. That is that's a very good, very complete answer. And one of the things I'd like to point out is the last little combo that we talked about in the previous section had absolutely nothing to do. In fact, everything I've commented on in the list is not addressing that strength. I just kind of took it as a given. You have a bunch of chainsaw ladies. They go forever, and when they hit things, there's just blood mist and everyone dies. That is 100% accurately what I would call the center of gravity of the list, is the fact that in melee, you were doing more damage there than anywhere else. You hit hard enough to where, like I said, like you said, every army in the game has to respect it, and if they don't, they're just not there anymore. It's not really a question that you get to say, nah to, and then still win games against you. So I think I think that is a mark of very good list design on your part, in that you have successfully identified your list and your factions, especially your sub factions, center of gravity, and then you just have a very large amount of tech built into the list to ensure that while the melee is your center of gravity, you didn't put yourself in a box by saying this is the only option that I have, and if someone can manage to limit my melee power, I don't have a plan B. You have a plan B and a plan C in this list, just because you have you have the layered characters, the resilience, you have the shooting, you have the tricks, you have the different layers of shooting. So overall, this man right here, very aware of the strategic capacities of his list and how to build to both accentuate and complement them.
Yeah, so I see a lot of Bloody Rose lists out there right now because the army is gaining a lot of popularity. It received a significant buff in Nephilim and is getting a lot of attention. You've seen it winning tournaments across the pond and in the United States, and you will almost certainly see more people taking them to podiums than previously for Sisters. This is probably the best Sisters have ever been at any point in the games right now, because they're not a historically powerful army. I see a lot of people who lean into the combat, and I have a lot of people ask me, like, oh, you have 2 Zephyr, 1 Seraphim. Why don't you cut the Seraphim for another Zephyrim squad? Why don't you cut the Castigator for Celestine? And I'm like, I just haven't had a game yet where I looked at it and I'm like, boy, I wish I hit harder in melee. And that's never the problem. And I have enough melee units to trade. Like, people are like, oh, you get more trading pieces. But, like, you don't need more than like 6 or 7 combat units.
Certainly.
Like, how many? Because I'm going to go in with 1 unit at a time usually, and the occasions where I go in with multiple units, I'm sending in the fight last. But if I do 2 or 3 rounds of that, no one has enough stuff left after that I need to have 10 combat trade pieces. And it's more about preserving my resources by using other things, using a Castigator to kill the guardsmen so that I don't have to send a Zephyrim squad number 3 after it.
Certainly. Okay. Well, cool. That is a advanced question number 1 hurdle cleared. So we're going to go ahead and go on to our second question. All right. So is there anything that lists in... Oh, go ahead. What's up?
I realize I only answered the first half of the question. I did not answer what the board state usually looks like after.
Yeah. Sorry, I forgot about that too. Go ahead.
My apologies. So what I found with the board, like there's like 3 checkpoints in the Sisters game that happen about 90% of the time.
Okay.
And it's basically when things go to plan. It's at the end of my turn 1. You see Sister squads, like the cheap stuff, like novitiates. I love novitiates. And like the Canoness with the fight last, like kind of burring their way upfield, getting into nooks and crannies as far forward as possible, but not actually in the open. Then there's stage 2, where the Sisters army steps out onto the other side of whatever wall they were on, and usually do it in mass, because once you give 1 target, you might as well give 5.
Sure.
And start dealing real damage, and this is when the reserves come in. And then step 3 is Vol crosses the midline, which Vol crosses the midline with the rest of the army moving around her, and she and everyone goes straight down the middle and removes any resistance that's left. It's usually a little bit of staging, then a step out and deal damage, force the engagement, and then it's a cleanup. Sure. It's just stage 1, 2, 3. And the army can be played very passively, I have secondaries over here, and I just sit here and I outscore you. And that works very well in singles play. But lately I've been doing a lot of team play between the American Teams Championship and my preparations for WTC. So I have been trying not to be satisfied with a narrow win.
Sure.
And I've been trying to go get more once I think that I have an advantage. It's capitalizing on it. And so that has led me to taking the entire castle with Vol straight downfield when I'm done with it.
Okay, and that is an interesting nuance, the differences between team and singles play right there. For those of you who may or may not be aware, in singles play, A W is a W. Doesn't really matter. Like win by an inch, win by a mile. You go to the next round. If you're in a tournament that's going to end up with multiple undefeateds, then the amount of VPs that you score can matter. But in most events that go to a single undefeated, if you just win every one of your games, it doesn't really matter what your scores are. 5 W's is 5 W's, and you get the GT or whatever it is. But in teams play, there's differential scoring where you go in and the scores are from 0 to 20, and depending on the margin of victory depends on how well your team does from round to round to round. So just hanging back, being passive, and just going, I won by 7, I get my W in teams play doesn't nearly work out. Like unless I'm missing my mark, that's a draw, right? Like a 7-point win is like a 10-10.
Yeah, if I won a game like 95 to 88, what would be reported to the team is an 11-9 victory.
11-9, okay, yeah.
Whereas if I won a game 80 to 40, I would get like a 16-4.
Yeah, sure.
Or 15-5, and it'd be much better for the team.
Definitely, yeah. So like
the differential matters a lot in teams.
Certainly. So you want to get as much as you possibly can while limiting the amount that your opponent goes, which encourages much more cutthroat. Just get in there and break your opponent's army rather than try and outlast them and edge out a victory. So that
absolutely,
definitely a very important nuance there. But I was very interested because like I didn't actually consider the 3 stages that you laid out. So like I've experienced the first stage where, you move up the table, you grab your objectives, you start doing your actions, you dare your opponent to come at you. And, there's some dancing and positioning back and forth. And then, it makes perfect sense. All right, now's go turn. Let's step on out. Let's do as much damage as we can. But then also I'm going to threat saturate while I'm doing that just to make it to where I can't focus my attention, or I'm not encouraged to focus my attention on any one thing. I'm probably going to get a little bit flustered. I'm going to get a little bit scattered. I'm going to try and answer as many threats as possible. And by doing that, a lot of undisciplined players will just end up doing a little bit to a lot of things and not actually removing whole threats. And that feels like it's just going to pay you dividends in the later parts of the game. Go ahead.
It really is. And a thing to mention with Sisters and their Miracle Ice abilities is that when people try to do the exact right amount in every spot, which is usually what happens to threat saturation, when someone puts, 3 units of Sanguinary Guard in your face, you usually split fire and you're like, this averages 7 Sanguinary Guard dead. Okay, that'll go here, and then the rest of the shots will go into the next one. Sure. And you'll split fire like that so that you get max efficiency to deal with as much as possible. When you do that against Sisters, one is that if you do that 3 times, one of them is going to roll average, one might roll a little above average, and one might roll a little below. So that's one of the elements of just threat saturation that works out well for the person saturating. Sure. The second part of that is the Sisters exclusive, which is Miracle Ice, which is that if you say, okay, it's going to take about, 10 saves to kill a 5-girl squad, and you do that in 3 different spots, I'm going to roll them like 6 at a time. So I'm going to roll the first 6 on one unit, and I'm going to fail like 4 of them. I'm going to be like, all right, the unit's dead, and they go on. And then one unit, I'm going to roll 6 saves, and I'm going to make 4 of them. And I'll be like, oh, this is the one to invest in. Then the next time I fail a save, I'm going to spend a command point, discard a Miracle Ice, modify it back up to a pass. Then I'm going to CPU roll 1. Then I'm going to spend a Miracle Ice auto pass 1. And suddenly the 10 saves on the unit that swung a little bit up in the first half, that suddenly became, I failed 2 out of 10 saves. And now this is a mostly full strength unit ready to come rock you. And if I'm even feeling in the mood, the Hospitaller will take it to a full strength unit just right off the bat, and it'll go get you. So when you get really close math at any point on Sisters, 1, I can use Miracle Ice to skew it slightly in my favor. 2, I can wait to see which of the several activations starts in my favor and then completely finish it off.
No, yeah, that makes perfect sense, and is a sign of high level player thought right there, because just man, the amount of like it feels so bad to overinvest to just make sure that you kill a unit of Sisters, right? Because they're not that threatening, and there's 4 or 5 other units that are also just as threatening, so you want to get as much efficiency as you can. But by doing that, like you said, you kind of play into your game. So it's one of another interlocking layer of how Sisters play that just makes the list a little bit overwhelming at the moment. Well, cool. We have with a little bit of backtrack, successfully cleared the first question. All right, let's go ahead and head to our second one. It's been touched on a little bit. So Is there anything that lists in the meta can do to disrupt your list center of gravity? Which is more like, what do games that the list loses look like? Like what beats you? And then what part of the list's plan are enemy forces capable of derailing?
Of course. So I think that Sisters are the best conventional army in the game. And it's a kind of funny way to say that, where everyone's like, oh, Sisters are just broken. They're the best army in the game. And I think that they have all of the best tangibles.
Mm-hmm.
And they're very, very strong. They are, I still think, the best army in the game. But what they're best at is playing a conventional game against a conventional army and winning it every time.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever I play against my friends that favor those kinds of armies, they get a little flustered because my Sisters feel unstoppable. Mm-hmm. What worries me the most is extremely dynamic or different or weird armies. So, for example, armies that do a bunch of mortals in the charge phase, or a bunch of mortals out of line of sight, or that have weird phase caps, or flyers, especially bombers, or indirect weapons. Anything a little bit unconventional is extremely scary for me. So a couple of notes from the weekend of ATC and other things that scared me from practice is I don't like Harpies,
Mm-hmm.
because Harpies can pivot twice, which means it's very hard to stop them from bombing me. They shoot. They're fast, so they can actually go over and shoot me. They have both an anti-tank weapon and a weight of shots weapon, which means they can fly over a 10-strong Retributor, kill 5 with bombs, and then diminish the strength of the Retributor unit. And then they can put 8 little anti-infantry shots into a Repentia squad, and then they can put 6 anti-tank shots into the Castigator. And then the second one flies over and hits the other Retributor squad, and they lose 5 models. And then the second Repentia unit takes 3 or 4 casualties. And then a second tank gets shot by venom cannons. And it's like, oh, that's really annoying. Or on turn 1, they fly over and bomb both Retributor squads, and then they leave the table.
Okay.
And it's like, now they didn't do the shooting, but now I don't get to kill them immediately. Because if they just stop in my deployment zone, they're dead.
Mm-hmm.
They know it. Everyone knows that Sisters' close range damage is very hard hitting. No one wants to get on the chin.
Sure.
But if they just chip me and leave in times when when I don't want it, then I start to run out of resources. I made some intentional choices. As soon as I start losing too many of any one of those things, it becomes a problem, and the list becomes one-dimensional. And the list never wants to be forced into being one-dimensional. Any army that becomes predictable is not happy. And then Sisters can be fragile sometimes because they're only 1 wound. They are only toughness 3. Once someone finds out that they can shoot them with ignore, cover, AP dash, like strength 4 shots in waves, I die really fast. Like literally, a Grey Knight squad with ignore cover kills a large number.
Are we saying that you might be a little bit worried about Imperial Fists?
Perhaps.
Okay.
Drop pod is just the scariest thing. So it's very interesting, and also Catan, Sky of Falling Stars. I hate that stuff.
Sure.
Because there's like D3 mortals to 3 different sister squads, and I'm like, well, I'm not healing 3 sister squads a turn. That's not how stratagems work.
Sure.
And then if my trade pieces come out as a 3-strong Repentia instead of an 8-strong Repentia because they got hit by 6 mortals before they actually came out, that's a lot less good for me. So unconventional damage being flyers, indirect, and like out of phase weird stuff like Catan. I like Repentia Fight on Death, so they're awesome charge units because they go in, they kill, and then if you charge them, then lol. So you have to shoot them. And then it's like, wow, I'm forcing you to shoot the thing that's 2 inches away from you when normally that's a problem you would charge.
Sure.
But if you just charge in and do a bunch of mortals, it's like, oh, this is not actually a good Fight on Death unit anymore. I'm not going to waste the CP. If you always fights first and I charge you and I make you fight last, then you're just like, we'll call it even and I'll pay 2 CP on the interrupt. And I'm like, I really didn't want this to happen. Sure. So unconventional rules, the kind of stuff you find in like Necrons, demons, those kind of armies,
sure,
actually are a little hard for Sisters. I think Sisters utterly obliterate every Imperial army, though.
Sure.
Like,
randomly guard.
We can ignore that.
Sure, of course, for the moment. Okay. Well, that's cool. So effectively, just if you have a conventional army whose game is to play some kind of fair, just Sisters out efficiency, out phase manipulate, out miracle dice, they're just going to have just a complete rough time against all that.
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay.
You need to have something weird in there to throw me off my game.
Something
if you just
weird.
take like an Imperial meta list, sisters are great for that stuff.
Gotcha. So my question, just because this is I was brainstorming lists that I think you might have had some bit of an issue with. I think that your multi-meltas actually give you they make it still a game, but can like Death Guard with the 12-inch bubble of you don't count it as charging ever. Is that something that gives your list a problem, or is it just too slow?
I have found that it's just too slow.
Okay.
The main thing is that obviously, since I am faster and I have the very reliable charges of Miracle Ice,
sure,
I can kind of like dictate where the fights happen. And then my secondaries are good enough that Death Guard walking around a 12-inch ball in any one spot isn't a huge problem, because I will go somewhere else. I'll deep strike 9 Zephyrim and I'll go kill whatever is on the screen somewhere else. So I'll buff them up with command points and we'll make it happen. And as you said, if you're a slow army and I just get to do 2 or 3 rounds of Retributors, it's kind of okay. Yeah. Also, I find that in general, good combat play works very well against slow and like weird armies like Death Guard. Sure. Where it's like, oh, you don't count as charging. And I'm like, okay. Here's 8 Repentia with 4 rerolls to hit and wound. Okay, you swing first. You got 2 CP out of me. I'll fight on death.
Sure. Okay. Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. And it kind of works out there.
All right. Cool. Well, then we're going to go ahead and slide into our last advanced question. And this one right here is just and we already covered it a little bit because you just straight up talked about like weird stuff, but more specifically like lists that we'll see in the meta. Are there any meta lists that are going to show up pseudo commonly in tournament play that are going to have a structural advantage in into your list? Do you have any bad matchups based on skews of specific kinds of lists? Like, do you live in mortal terror of a Necron triple Catan list? It sounds like you might.
So I think that like conceptually double Catan Necrons is going to be one of those things that's the most difficult for me. I have not gotten a chance to practice that matchup yet, unfortunately, but I do think it's potentially quite a challenging one. And that's because they can do mortals out of line of sight with Sky of Falling Stars, and they can do it to a couple of units pretty consistently. And, you know, they're not very good against units that are less than 5 models, but I don't really have any of those. And once my units get less than 5 models, they're not actually that useful. So I try to heal them back up to 5 models, at which point they get hit right again. I'm also single wound models with power armor and armor contempt and cover, and that's not very helpful against mortal wounds. And then Catan themselves, of course, are one of those few units that can sit within 24 inches of a Repentia and strictly not die, because I can only do 3 wounds at a time. So it's quite an interesting challenge. And then, of course, it's usually stapled onto 1,000+ points of Necrons. And Necrons have very good secondaries of their own. They're often objective secured, so they play a good primary game. They have their own weird tech pieces, not as many as me in general, but still are quite useful. So it kind of becomes a race against the clock where I have to go kill all of the OBSEC Necron stuff, because if we both sit back and I get good secondaries and they get good secondaries, then either I'm going first and I have to push out on, at some point, or they're going second, or they're going first and they push out at a point where I've been hit by Skyfalling Stars for like 4 turns in a row. And at that point, they probably have the advantage if I've just gotten hit by mortals. Because in a double Catan list, they can put out 6 Skyfalling Stars a turn. And what that is you roll a dice for each unit for a unit within 24 inches. So each Catan picks 3. So they can pick 3 units twice if they want. And if they roll under the number of models in the unit and it's not a 6, I take D3 mortals. So on a 10 strong Retributors, that's on a 2+ smite me. And then the second Catan says, hey, that 7 strong Retributor squad. On a 2+, I smite them. And they just do that 3 times to 2 units, or do that 2 times to 3 units. And I suddenly have a Repentia squad that's half dead and 2 Retributors that are very close to death. And now it's like, okay, do I step out the Retributors now when I don't have optimal targets? Or do I wait and take a second round of that and find out if I'm dead?
Yeah, no, totally.
Quite difficult conceptually. Sure. I may have enough stuff to just power through and kill all the OBSEC Necrons and then let 2 Catan just do what they do while I hold objectives while outnumbering them, my comfort zone, into an army that is particularly well equipped to deal with me. Sure.
Okay, yeah. And then Necrons also have point and click, turn off cover for everything against a unit. They have weird stuff like Hexmark destroyers that can just drop down and force you to make a whole bunch of saves. They can also deep strike and counter shoot your deep strike, which I'm just kind of excited about the fact that that a Hexmark destroyer might be a pretty good meta pick.
Yeah.
Cool. Is there anything outside of... Yeah, definitely. Is there anything outside of Necrons that you think might be problematic build-wise in the meta for the list that you've assembled?
In the meta, no, not as much. I unironically think that that Imperial Guard are good into sisters,
Sure.
but like that's not really in the meta, so I haven't spent much time worrying about it.
Fair.
Other than that, Tau can be challenging because they can be very fast with their shooting and they hit quite hard. Sure. I still worry a little bit about the Craft World Eldar Hail of Doom lists, but I think I have an advantage there. It's not insurmountable by any means. I think I have an advantage there. It's just interesting.
Okay.
Other than that, anything with a good indirect, like weird knight stuff that's indirect, always provides an extra layer of challenge.
Okay. So indirect flyers, things that are phase locked and can do mortals out of line of sight, which is, I think the list of that is literally just Catan.
Tyrannid psychic powers can do it as well, like Neuroparasite.
Okay.
Neuroparasite just chaining through stuff out of my deny range because I have potent deny abilities. But if they just get out of that, then it's like, oh, okay, well, they can just kill like the same thing. They can just do 5 Retributors dead.
Yeah.
And now take a morale check. And if they do that early game, I may not have a good Miracle Dice for that.
Sure.
I usually have a couple ones by the time we end the game, but turn 1, they go first. They get a synapse like Harpy up. They bomb me. They kill 5. Then they Neuroparasite kill 2 or 3 more. And then the Harpy shoots me. And I'm like, oh, well, 3 Retributors do not tank a Harpy. 10 do. 3 don't.
3 do not. Okay.
And it just becomes a problem.
All right. Okay. So come at it sideways. Don't try and fight it conventionally. And cool. I think we have pretty well gained a decent understanding of the list that you are currently and hopefully in the near future going to continue to rock everyone's worlds with. Hopefully this is going to be some useful insights into the play of it and other lists that are constructed off it as inspiration. And hopefully, I'm not trying to make your life harder, but maybe your life will be a little bit harder. So I would like to thank the estimable and once again redoubtable John Lennon for joining me here today. He would say goodbye, but we had a little bit of technical issues towards the end. It was a joy and a pleasure and a privilege to have him and his awesome insight into the game on Hank's List Corner this fine Tuesday. And everyone else, have a nice day.